are live. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to the Rough Estimate podcast. This is our second podcast. I'm John Martin, and this is Francis Kett.
Hello everybody.
Yep, now we're doing my article, which is called The Psyche's Hinterland, and basically about modern spiritualism. I basically wrote this article to talk about the different versions of modern spiritualism which are trying to be created, and the historical attempts to create it in mostly Western society, but in other countries. Because I argue that there are lots of kind of manifestations of mysticism or kind of magical belief that kind of seep into our modern lives, and that this is kind of inevitable, that people kind of want magic to exist, or they seek out magical ways of explaining the world, and that it's better to kind of recognize it and consciously try to construct it than repress it. That would be my belief, what I argue in the article.
Well, when you're talking about modern spiritualism, are you talking about a kind of Jungian quest to replace religion, or are you talking about animism, or just people's belief in the supernatural and magic? Or
yeah, I guess it's hard to distinguish, but I think the belief in some kind of supernatural entity is probably the key to it, or the belief that there are beings and worlds that exist outside of the reality that we experience, and that this tells us how to act. That probably in essence is spiritualism or mysticism. Maybe you'd have a different definition, but do you think that works?
Yeah, you started off by talking about superheroes, right?
Yeah, so I mean, other people dispute this, but I think obviously a lot of ideas of mysticism kind of seep into entertainment culture. So obviously video games, movies, there's demons, there's wizards, monsters, sometimes gods, but I think it's most evident in superheroes, because superheroes, I think, are basically like Greek heroes, that they're not gods, but the gods have chosen them and given them special powers. So Hercules, son of Zeus, he's given super strength. Perseus, he's given artifacts from gods that have powers. So superheroes are basically that, except they get their powers from, aliens or chemical serums or radioactivity. And also, like Greek heroes, they have this responsibility to use their powers for good and not for evil. They end up hurting people they're close to. If they're not careful, some of them choose evil and become supervillains. So in its own way, I think this is the kind of the American response to Greek heroes.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the Greek point, because I think we think of it as a sort of modern thing, having multiple protagonists sort of cross over and go into the same fiction. But with the story of Jason and the Argonauts, essentially that's one of the Greek myths which puts together a lot of the heroes in the same journey. So you have Hercules, who's one of the heroes on the Argonaut. He's one of the Argonauts. Obviously, you have Jason. Then you have Orpheus, who's Apollo's son, who's given the gift of music. And so it's kind of like a Avengers, sort of Greek hero journey on the Argonauts, I think.
In the Avengers of its day, yeah. Actually, I didn't think of that, but that's totally true. Hercules is sort of retired, but he's been brought back for the amazing adventure of Jason the Argonauts.
Yeah, it's like equivalent of Iron Man, and then Orpheus would be like Thor or something. I don't know, but yeah, you could see how they thought about it in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, well, now the most popular mythic entertainment is Vikings. And some people argue this is because we live in an age of lockdowns and social isolation. So Vikings are so appealing because, we want to go out and explore the world. And, they're sort of manly and primal. And that's why we like them so much. I think there is something to that. But I think superheroes is definitely the modern version. Another trend that I read about is astrology. Like most ancient societies use astrology to make predictions. They see it as part of almost a way of understanding the world. And I feel like now astrology is equally popular. Or it's probably more popular than ever. Probably even more than any point in history, you could argue, because it's like people who make thousands of dollars learning astrology degrees online, fortune telling for, usually single women who want to find a man who's good for them. But all this gets combined with stuff like alternative medicine, the idea of a conscious universe with places of healing and spiritual healing. So they all seem to be kind of features of what you might call neo-shamanism, or taking ancient beliefs and kind of reviving them and saying that this is like a discoverable reality that you can't access in your normal life. That really exists, and people definitely really believe this stuff. It's not just like role playing and LARPing, and I think it's like that's indicative of the fact that it's something people tend to believe in because they want that kind of belief that their life doesn't just revolve around Netflix and a monthly salary. They want something more. So that's why I think we should kind of engage with it a bit.
You brought this up the other day that people can get astrology degrees and study it. I had no idea about this.
So actually I'm teaching a Turkish student, and she told me about this, that she basically takes a course online, and the way she described it literally takes like years and to study it, and costs like a lot of money, and then you get I don't know if it's a degree, but it's definitely a qualification, and then it's basically like a license to do astrology and fortune telling in Turkey. Now it might be because Turkey has more of a tradition of this, but I had no idea it was so developed until she told me about it.
Yeah, I never heard of it. I know someone who writes for an astrology magazine. I don't think she has this qualification, so might not have to out her. But yeah, interesting. I guess is it popular though now because there's just more people and it's more of a thing, and we're online and we can find those communities more easily. And maybe there were just always people who were into astrology, or are there actually a greater percentage of people who are concerned with it now? Do you think?
I think surely it's more popular now because. Yes, in the 1970s and 80s, you have the New Age movement. So that's when you get stuff like 70s cults and the Satanists and kind of like hippie magic and people doing all that kind of thing. But I don't think then people were really interested in astrology. I just don't think it really registered. I don't know why it's popular now. It's a really interesting question. But I feel like probably because of the internet. Because now you can go online and read about, like, here's how the Greeks and the Egyptians calculated these things. Here's what star signs mean. So I think it's just the internet allows these kind of things to spread. So maybe it was just more isolated before.
Well, you talk about the history of belief in magic, right? Could you go through that a little bit? I thought it was interesting.
Yeah. So, of course, like ancient people, they all believe in magic. They believe in astrology. They believe in gods and magical creatures. There's no question that magic exists to ancient people. They just think there are different ways of accessing it. So even in sort of tribal communities like the Native Americans and the Inuits, they basically think there's a spiritual world where everything like rocks and trees and rivers have their own spirits. And that when you dream or when you take psychedelic drugs or hallucinate even, then you're basically entering that spirit world. And almost all of ancient religion kind of revolves around this idea that you can enter the spirit world and appease the spirits somehow. So shamans directly talk about doing this. So then obviously with empires comes organized religion. So comes in different forms, but you have Greek and Egyptian religion, which is a bit more, it's categorized into actual deities, recognizable gods. And Christianity is much more controlling because it's monotheist, it only has one god. It basically says that God has a monopoly on magic, and so practicing other forms of magic is illegal. So the Christian church in the beginning teaches that you can do magic, but they say it's illegal because you should only do it. It's only priests who are allowed to do it. So there are all these edicts banning magic in in Paris and London in the medieval times. So there are interesting attempts in ancient history to try and make a universal spiritual religion. So there are some scholars who argue that Alexander the Great basically tried to do this, that he saw himself as being the leader of a new world order where all religions would be joined. So in the Hellenistic world, you have like Greeks in Afghanistan, in Egypt, in Pakistan, in India, and they make all these schools of thought like the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Neoplatonists. So these are all meant to be unifications of religious beliefs and saying that there's all one belief that this leads towards. If that makes sense.
Hang on, what's Alexander the Great's take? Because I haven't heard this.
So we only know Alexander's opinions on things through his like kind of scribes who followed him around. But they say that he said stuff like, I am the heralder of a new belief, and that after me I will unify all of mankind. So he says these statements, and so that's interpreted by some to mean that he saw himself as joining all the religions into one great religion. Kind of like what Genghis Khan thought, because he had like Buddhists and Christians and Muslims, and he said like, yeah, all these religions are right, but really there's Mongol philosophy is superior. So it was maybe a little bit like that.
It's interesting. Have you heard of I think we talked before about Akhenaten, or he's come up slightly.
Yeah, yeah. I've written about him in the past. Yeah, I do. So he's interesting.
Yeah, so it seems that he's essentially the father of Tutankhamun, from people who don't know, and he's basically. I think this is interesting because the reason why Tutankhamun takes so long to find relative to other Rosetta Stone, etc., which is discovered in Napoleon times, is because the Egyptians essentially wrote them out of existence, the two of them, because Akhenaten attempts to reconfigure the whole of Egyptian society into essentially a monotheistic one instead of a polytheistic one. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So basically, we don't know, but he makes it monotheist. So he says Ra is the only god, and he is the son of Ra. So he's the incarnation of Ra on Earth. And then he also changes Egyptian art completely. He makes it very realistic looking compared to the kind of rigid, square, patterned Egyptian art. So there's many theories about it. So Freud thinks that this influences Christianity because you can see the obvious parallels. He's the son of God, the son of Ra. And there are others who think that this is Greek influence, that because there's Greek sailors who land at the place where Akhenaten sets up his new court. And then there's ideas that he's trying to kind of remove the influences of the priests because they're too powerful. We really don't know. It's very, very interesting. The reason this is important is because later you get the influences from Greek mystery cults. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're called just the mysteries, the Dionysian mysteries, the Orphic mysteries. So they're basically rural Greek cults. So there's, the famous ones are the Dionysian mysteries, and they're called the Dionysian orgies. The orgy does not mean group sex to the Greeks. It means initiation or ceremony. So yeah, all these texts saying the Greeks were doing orgies, it just means they were doing rituals. So what seems to have happened is that they went to a hilltop in secret and they kind of hit each other with sticks and whip each other and drink wine and play music to get in kind of a state of trance, which they call ecstasis, just where we get our word ecstasy, the feeling of being outside of the body. So, and then they would kind of be in this trance state, and that was seen as channeling the energy of Dionysus.
This is on The Secret History. This is essentially what The Secret History is about, like trying to reenact Dionysian rituals, but in modern day, and get yourself into a kind of state of psychosis, and reunite yourself with Dionysus.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it was kind of the idea of controlling divine madness, because the idea is that people get these crazed drives and urges, and that doing that was a way of controlling it. So it's kind of the opposite of what people think. People think of Dionysian orgies as being like all about a party and having a good time. It's kind of the opposite in a way. It's only in Roman times it seemed to have evolved into like a sex cult. So then the Romans banned it and executed a lot of the leaders. So that's why it has that image today. So basically these Egyptian and Greek beliefs seem to have become combined in a way, basically by Christians. So there's an early Christian group called the Gnostics, and they sort of say that Jesus and the Jewish prophets are all an incarnation of the kind of the world spirit, which is called the monad, and that the world is separated to a realm of light and a realm of darkness, and we're kind of in the middle. And that by, behaving well and not giving into temptation, you will then ascend into the realm of light. And the entire physical world that we live in is controlled by the forces of darkness and the demons. So this is obviously inspired also by Zoroastrianism, where there's a kind of a dark lord and a lord of light fighting each other. So they kind of advocated a one world religion, basically, where they said that. And after them, you get a movement called Manichaeism, which basically incorporates Buddhism and says that Buddha, Jesus, the Jewish prophets, they're all incarnations of the forces of light. And so they create this kind of ladder where you can ascend the realms of light to reach the world spirit. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, interesting use of the word monad, because I think it's from the Pythagoreans who create it. It just means the beginning number of a series, but Leibniz, the philosopher, also uses it in metaphysics. So he sort of has the idea that everything in the universe is made up of monads, and that each monad is unique and indestructible. And so, yeah, it's quite not too dissimilar in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to know where it comes from, because the Pythagorean cults, they worship numbers, and they believe that this kind of gets combined with Plato, so the realm of perfect forms. They think that the realm of perfect forms is made of numbers. and that numbers kind of trickle down to our realm, and that's why we can use maths at all. And some of the Gnostics kind of diverse, they take on this idea. They start to believe that you can like use maths and science to tap into the magic realm, and it will give you magic powers to do with casting spells, to creating gold out of metals, predicting the future. So they become a group called the Hermeticists, or the Hermetics, who try and introduce this into medieval Europe. So basically, a lot of our ideas of witches and wizards come from this group, like crystal balls, casting spells with staffs. But it's outlawed by the church because it's seen as an illegal way of doing magic. It's not condoned by Bible.
So you have the Gnostics, which are an early Christian group, and they're superseded by the... What are they called? The Hermetics?
Hermeticists. So the name comes from Hermes, the Greek god, but he's supposed to be... He's combined with the Egyptian god Thoth, so it's kind of it's a combination of Greek and Egyptian thought in Alexandria, because that was a sort of Greek-Egyptian university.
Okay, but they're after the Gnostics, who are Christian?
Yes, as far as we know.
Okay. How does that belief trickle down into later society? Are they persecuted? Like, what sort of influence do they have?
Yeah, they are. So things like casting spells and doing necromancy, bringing people back to life, that becomes something that's engaged in heavily by the kind of European upper classes. And it basically evolves into a group of secret cults, specifically the Rosicrucians, the Order of the Golden Dawn, and later the Freemasons, who are probably the most famous. So these are all groups that basically say that you can do magic, that we will teach you a kind of secret magic that the church won't teach you. So Casanova, he was a kind of writer and famous playboy living in Italy, he was a Rosicrucian. Yeah, and he lived in Venice, yeah, and he would recruit women by telling them he could bring their dead relatives back to life, that he could literally turn them into men. So he seemed to have thought he had magic powers because he was part of this group. And basically all these cults later they become the origins of modern conspiracy theories. Also the Freemasons famously, but later they get combined with financial groups like the Rothschilds, and even today, like things like Bohemian Grove, they're identified with these secret orders like the Order of the Golden Dawn. So even at the time, in like the 17th century, there's the idea that these cults are controlling the upper classes of the European elites, which is an idea that we still have today. But I think the reason it's important is because all of these spiritualist ideas get pushed out into illegal territory by the church. And as science and reason comes to dominate in Europe, basically the church becomes more and more materialistic because it tries to sort of fight science on its own terms and say, we have the truth, the Bible is the truth. And you can verify it, you can test it. With the Protestants, magic gets seen as like something just either like wrong and not to engage with at all. And I think that's why in Western culture, the whole realm of sort of magic, spiritual belief is kind of remains underdeveloped as a consequence of this struggle.
So in a way, sorry, just to back up a little bit. So modern conspiracy theories are really updated conspiracy theories which have existed since the 17th century, earlier, later, but. Yeah.
I mean, again, it's the printing press. Before then, you have like these Hermetic cults, but obviously people don't know about them so much.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Is there kind of parallels? Because do you know if these beliefs got more widespread because of the church making them illegal? It sounds like it did.
No, I think the church was actually fairly successful in limiting them because it does seem to, as far as we know, it never seems to become like a popular movement. In a way that Tantric Buddhism or like Chinese esotericism, they became like mass religions with huge followings, and that never really happened with any Christian group. So I think in a way, it was always relegated to the fringe, and that's why it has this kind of like, shady feeling like the occult, and it's Satanists and it involves like evil things. That's why we think of it that way.
I was thinking of drawing a parallel between modern social medias banning conspiracy theories and whether that's creating the Streisand effect and making them more prevalent, but maybe that's actually working and driving them out towards the fringes.
Yeah, but I think driving them towards the fringes is unhealthy because it means people get into these almost like cult groups that they then think that leads to a worse outcome. Because if you compare it to like the Eastern religions, they're much more integrated with these spiritual ideas, I think, than Western ones are.
So don't ban them; let them sort of integrate.
Yeah. I mean, you could. I guess the crux of the issue is whether is whether these beliefs are harmful or not. Because I think, not studying them enough leads to people finding these same beliefs of spiritualism in politics. And I think that's where it gets kind of dangerous. So I use the example of Republican France, where you have after the French Revolution, the whole of French society becomes atheist, and then they adopt something called basically the religion of reason. They create huge temples of reason, they have gods of reason, they worship a cult of the supreme being. And basically all this it becomes an excuse for dictatorship, and they kind of execute thousands of people. And I think that same impulse is there in later totalitarian groups like communists and fascists. I don't think that should be overdone, but I think there is like a certain sense that when political people take on these spiritual ideas that are seen as bad, that they embrace them so strongly that they go way too far with them. And you can't help think that if they were treated as less, handled more carefully, that people wouldn't engage in them so much. Like they wouldn't go to the extremes that they did.
Yeah, I remember talking about the cult of the supreme being. I guess it's so interesting because there's a really it's probably the biggest example where there's a real concerted effort to replace religion with something which isn't religion, which is very much not religion and is guided by reason and logic, and they basically end up creating religion almost immediately, right? It's so fascinating because it's them. Don't they end up burning people at the stake for not believing in the supreme being and things like this, or have I made that up?
There's mass persecutions, but I think from what I've read, it's mostly to do with like other things that basically if you weren't participating in the festivals, it was easier to label you a counter-revolutionary and then, put your name on the list and have you executed. So it wasn't so formal as like you have to go or you'll be executed. It was more like, look, to show you're a good citizen who supports the republic, do these things, otherwise you're in danger. So it was that kind of like, maybe not so totalitarian, but more kind of creeping authoritarian. But
they did end up sort of mimicking rituals, didn't they? Almost kind of religious rituals in a way. They'd have sort of ceremonies about the cult of the supreme being and the Church of Reason, and they'd worship idols of Voltaire, etc., wouldn't they?
Yeah, so they had like Voltaire, Isaac Newton, I think Victor Hugo even, kind of literally made statues of them and worshipped in churches. They had there was Lady Reason. It was kind of modeled after Lady Liberty. She was a statue carried through the streets. There were huge bonfires. There were these dances and kind of apparently scantily clad women, which was just to try and attract people. And because they said basically they were so boring that people weren't going to them, so they had to find ways to make it more exciting.
No one likes our new religion.
Yeah, our new religion, yeah. We need to find cheap entertainment.
We don't have to bother with that anymore. No, not Christian.
Well, they even have they had chess sets using philosophers instead of kings and queens and playing cards, where you've got like Isaac Newton and they replaced the calendar from day one and decimalized everything. So yeah.
It's so similar to Soviet regimes, isn't it? Like because I think they also changed the calendar in the Soviet Union for a brief time.
Yeah, they make it and year zero, like in Cambodia. I mean, the parallels are so huge, and it makes you really wish that humanists today would actually take it seriously, because humanists today, they're just like, atheism is in the ascendant, and that can only be a good thing. They don't even. The French Revolution, it's the most clear time where they tried to make a belief system out of rationality, and it went so terribly wrong. And communism is, in a way, like another version of that, except it's more totalitarian. But, you've just got to look at that and think that, surely can't just assume that it's all going to be totally fine. It's the elephant in the room in a way, that people obviously see this in things like environmentalism, social justice, people who are really on the far left. That this basically seems to be people finding a religion out of politics, except it's been updated to be kind of like a gender, racial egalitarianism combined with, socialism that will create the new utopian paradise. That isn't even a whole lot different. I mean, it's obviously inspired by communism a lot of the time. And so the belief that these ideas, like, good no matter what, is I think, silly.
Yeah, I remember walking around ex-Soviet countries like Bulgaria and Ukraine, and a lot of the time, instead of memorials and statues of actual figures, you'll get statues to the unknown soldier. And I thought it was interesting after the Colston statue was pushed into the sea in Bristol. You followed this, right? The Bristol Harbour.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so the protesters out in secret, some of the students replaced on the plinth with a with a new statue. Guess what it was?
I think I saw it. Was it just like a random woman?
Yeah, it was the unknown protester. But the parallels are just super interesting, especially the year zero. They're like always harkening back to the year zero. I mean, North Korea had its year zero after Kim Jong-il died, I think.
Yeah. Cambodia too.
Yeah, well, Cambodia does. No, but they don't still have it, right? North Korea still has it. They're in like the year 128, I think, at the minute.
Right, yeah. So Cambodia, I think it was abolished after Pol Pot, but yeah, North Korea still has it.
Yeah, it's the year 112. No, sorry, it's 111 is the year in North Korea.
Yeah, but maybe the point of most of that is not to say that atheism and spiritualism is bad, but more to the fact that attempts to kind of say the old order is wicked and we're going to overthrow it and replace it with rational belief, that sort of almost always seems to go wrong. I think there's pretty much any time that happens to say we're going to create this belief system and it will be better, I think is always a bad idea. Whereas a lot of the other things, like you always have these sort of more subtle movements. And I think it's the same with astrology and neo-paganism and all these other things. I think they're basically harmless most of the time. Because, for example, the neo-paganists, it's mostly like people LARPing as like a follower of Odin or a Native American tribesman. And it's interesting that in Britain, the Wiccan groups, they basically write that we're enacting Carl Jung's ideas. We're just enacting archetypes and psychological metaphors. They're not saying that this is the religion everyone should join. So I think in that way, because it's more of a social hobby thing, it's actually quite good for people compared to the political tendency, which says we have the truth and you will all believe in it.
I guess like 2 points there. Like the first is that the sort of the idea that we're in a kind of post-Christian world, as we talked about, that people like Nietzsche brought this up a lot, and there's people like Peterson who've sort of popularized it, I guess. That we're not really an atheist society. We're kind of post-Christian one. We don't believe it in the same way we used to believe it, but we still abide by Christian ethics. We still have some of the rituals. We still have the belief system if we don't have the actual beliefs themselves. And so you tend to. I mean, it sort of harkens back to what I was talking about with the fantasy versus magical realism. Like in a way, fantasy is building on something very, very old. It's building on the epic. It's building on mythology, which has been created over hundreds and thousands of years in a lot of cases. And it's very difficult to just replace that with something which has been... It's not that... I don't want to say overnight. It's not that you're replacing it. It's impossible to replace. It's that there's been less work done into it. And one author... Really, if you're trying to... And the authors that did try to replace mythologies with their own, there were just one author doing one text or a series of texts in lifetimes of work. And that doesn't really hold up towards thousands of years of oral tradition, really, because of course it wouldn't, if you think about it.
Yeah, it's like trying to. So there's the humanist. I think it's A.C. Grayling. You probably heard of him, the humanist. So he wrote a humanist Bible, and I mean it's the same like futility of trying to replace the Bible with an. It's of course it's things like be nice to people, don't be mean, and think of others first. And so a lot of stuff that modern people believe in, but it's just like the futility of trying to make an organized religion out of it. Like the act of doing it makes you realize how it's so impossible and why it doesn't work. Yeah, so there are humanists. So there's a humanist called Alain de Botton, and he basically says that in the near future there are already atheist churches, right? But he says there'll be priests who are basically like therapists. Therapists will be the new priests. And in a way they already are. We already go to like therapists and say, couples go to them with problems. People talk to them about problems in their families, about what they should do to be a good person. So that's already happening. It kind of feels inevitable, but I think a lot of this is now, you mentioned Jordan Peterson. A lot of this religious urge, I think, is now manifesting in the self-help movement. But the self-help movement is now like, Peterson gets like, tens of millions of followers, same with other writers. Even if you look at best-selling books, now they're all self-help books. So I think basically this is the new religious landscape. The new religions of the future will be self-help groups and movements that have political undertone. And also maybe adopt things like kind of ritual cults to make people feel better, like art therapy, dance therapy. You can actually imagine that. But I think it absolutely should be gradual rather than this huge attempt to remodel everything. Like that's actually quite a positive development. Because if you look at the religions since in the 21st century, the only new religions that have actually been created apart from Christian churches in Korea and China and Japan, they're all parody religions, basically. So you have like the Satanists, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, Jediism. So this just shows that like organized religion, I think, is probably had its day. And I think the new religions will be decentralized. Yeah. And I think that should be encouraged. Linking it to a political movement should be discouraged. It should be separate.
It is interesting, the idea of having decentralized religion versus what we've had before. I guess that, you could talk all day about whether the power of the Pope is waning and whether he's as relevant as he was, and whether obviously there's people like the Dalai Lama and other figures. But if you have, is a decentralized religion really religion? Is my point? Is it not just a kind of series of cults? Like, say, I don't know. Jordan Peterson is probably the biggest of the self-help movement. There's people like Les Brown and Tony Robbins, I think, who are popular self-help people. But I think probably Jordan Peterson's the first to kind of link it with a sort of theological background / philosophical background in that way. But he's not really. Is he really a figurehead of anything? Like, not really. He doesn't. He could come out and give his opinion on things, and people would probably agree with it and argue. But I don't know. I struggle to imagine there being sort of institutions around self-help, like we have churches, or like we have. I get your point about how we're having they're sort of replacing the priestly class therapists, because I did used to work with the humanists, and they're having humanist chaplains sort of going giving people their last rites in hospitals. That's like a big thing which Humanists UK have been working on, which I think is quite a good thing to do. People might necessarily want to be sort of persuaded to convert last minute when they're on their deathbed, and so getting a humanisty chaplain can be quite a nice ritual. So I think rituals are important, and maybe that's something the self-help movement could work on. But if it's decentralized, how easy is that to do?
Well, it's a good question, because the religions before Christianity, Islam, and they're decentralized, and they still are in India and in other parts of the world, even parts of China that are not so influenced by the government. That's also the religions aren't centralized in the way that they are in the Abrahamic religions. So they're the outliers. So I don't think it's as impossible to imagine as you might think. I think that it will get combined with rituals. I think it will just be like different groups and different societies. So you could argue that Peterson's advocating Western liberalism, which I think he absolutely is. He's coming out of that philosophical tradition. But he's not representative of a church or an organization. So probably there will be organizations, but there'll be right now within therapy, you can take different types of therapy. You can go to different types of self-help groups. So I think it probably will be a bit like that. But the last thing I want to mention is that I honestly think it would be a good idea for modern governments to create ministries of morality, which I know that sounds like the most Orwellian dystopian thing ever. But I think we already kind of have scientists and therapists and psychologists being this is how you should live. If you do this, you're a good person. If you do this, you're a bad person. So I just think it would be better to make an Institute of Public Morality that just makes recommendations and says, and all they do is study morality and say that this, here's the evidence. We're studying well-being, what makes people happy, what makes people satisfied. I think defining it in that way actually would be a good thing on the whole, if it was kept relatively separate from political interference, which now it isn't.
Yeah, it does sound Orwellian. I know what you mean. I guess I'm cautious about setting up a kind of sort of happiness prescription government-run institute. I'm all for a government committee for essentially looking into spiritualism and see it and putting more money towards research, anthropological research into what makes society tick and what sustains people's motivations and interests and hobbies and passions. But I guess I'd sort of draw the line at whether the government would be. I suppose they already make public health policy, so could you have a kind of public spiritualism policy? I struggle to imagine what they do other than provide tax incentives for certain things. I guess you could just say, give self-help tax-free status. Would probably be the equivalent of what you would have done to a religion in the past. Maybe it'd be good.
Maybe it shouldn't be governmental, and maybe it could be a sort of university-led effort. But Yeah, like if you think about it, in Britain we already have a minister of loneliness who's set up to study like mental health and depression. It's not a huge stretch from that to imagine the Ministry for Happiness and therefore the Ministry of Morality. And it's like,
I was going to say, do you not think the mental health movement in a way is that? It's a way to measure what makes people satisfied or happy or content in themselves long term, and that is kind of a study of spiritualism and what makes people motivated or not motivated. Really, that's what it is, I think.
yeah, exactly. So I think now Western governments do it implicitly. We already have like health experts and mental health experts saying like, we are the authority, we are the science, this is what you should do. Whereas if you actually had institutions, and I think there should probably be a few of them, I think it should be kind of pluralized rather than one like eternal panel that just basically were dedicated to studying morality, happiness, well-being, and just made recommendations, but let's say they could be funded by the government. I mean, there'd be the danger of them sort of like, getting too much power, but if they were but then the church was funded by the government, and the church was that, and now it doesn't exist anymore. So I feel like, it exists, but it doesn't have any way of the power. So I feel like in a way it's just seeing as we're going to have it anyway, we might as well make it a formal institution so that it could be basically more easily defined and studied.
Surely that's centralizing it though.
Yeah, but I think in that case, okay, so maybe a degree of centralization is good to avoid like massive malpractice or people doing very, very unhealthy things, for example.
Centralized, but not too much. A little bit decentralized.
Yeah. But I think no, I'm just saying inevitably it will be decentralized. But I think it's basically good to have. It would be good to have something like that to inform government policy, because inevitably it's going to be influenced by that anyway.
Yeah, I do agree. I sort of struggle to imagine exactly what it would look like and what it would do, but I can prepare my letter to my MP.
Yeah, that's also about 40 minutes. We covered everything I wanted to cover. So yeah, great.
Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and we'll see you shortly.